Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Classic English Literature Podcast, the greatest hits of English lit. My name's Matthew McDonough, and I'm really glad you're with me today. Before we begin, I would like to let you know that I've added a Twitter feed for the show with the handle @ClassicEnglish1. That's @ClassicEnglish and the numeral 1. You can follow the podcast also on Instagram and Facebook. And if you want to get in touch with me directly, you can email me at classicenglishLiterature@gmail.com. Now, I also have another bit of business that I need to address before we begin. I must offer the first of what will no doubt be an elephant full of apologies in this podcast series. Apparently, in episode 2, called The Coming of the Anglo-Saxons, I whiffed the title line in the actual script. So, after a surreal metaphor, comparing the plight of ancient Celts to pickles on a charcuterie platter, which probably deserves its own apology, mea culpa, I announced that these Romanized Britons were faced with, wait for it, the coming of the Britons. I meant Saxons, obviously. What a wally. When last we spoke, we learned of the first poet and poem in English, Caedmon's Hymn, and how its assertion of God's eternity would prove foundational for early Anglo-Saxon poets. This week, I'd like to expand this idea by exploring what many consider ground zero for English poetry. I'm speaking of the epic Beowulf, the first lengthy text in our language. Let's first explain what an epic is. We use the term colloquially nowadays to refer to anything large or overwhelming or just plain awesome. But as a literary term, epic has a particular definition. It's a long narrative poem concerning the exploits of an epic hero. Now, the epic hero is a protagonist, a character who embodies the values and virtues of his culture. Now, you may be familiar with the classical epics by Homer and Virgil, like the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, or maybe with John Milton's early modern epic, Paradise Lost. An epic is a poem, it's long, it tells a story, and that story concerns the adventures and exploits of a character that embodies the virtues and values of the culture that produces the poem. Okay? Beowulf is concerned with the exploits of its eponymous hero, a brave Scandinavian warrior who defeats monsters and becomes a powerful king. Now, ironically, though it's composed in English and is considered the very foundation of English literature, none of its characters are English, and nor does the story take place in England. Rather, Beowulf is a Geat, or a Yayat. I've heard it pronounced both ways, but I'm going to stick with Geat, which is a member of a tribe that inhabited what is now southern Sweden. And his adventures take place largely in Denmark. So you can almost think of the world of Beowulf as kind of the Viking world that we may be familiar with. Here's a streamlined super summary of this rather lengthy poem. So if you haven't read it, you'll get enough here to follow along with what I'm saying. And if you have read the poem, if you followed the links or had a copy of your own, this will just be a refresher. The poem begins with the famous what, that rousing call to attention that means something like lo or hey, pay attention. We then get a history of the Danish kings up to the reign of the current king, whose name is Hrothgar. What a great name, Hrothgar. Who is well loved by his people and he's successful in war. He builds a spectacular mead hall, which he calls Heorot, in which he will rule justly and generously. Now, a mead hall is like a palace, but it's a gathering place more like. It's a big banqueting hall where the king and his followers and his retinue and entourage, they can all gather and drink mead, which is an alcoholic beverage made of fermented honey, and tell stories and feast and just celebrate their awesomeness. So he builds this mead hall, Heorot, and he will rule in it justly and generously. But all is not well. Now, in a scene which never fails to remind me of the grumpy Grinch complaining about his noisy neighbors down in Whoville, a monster named Grendel is provoked by the singing and carousing of Hrothgar's followers. Late, one dark and stormy night, Grendel swoops down upon Heorot and kills 30 warriors as they sleep. For the next 12 winters, Grendel haunts and hounds Hrothgar's posse. Finally, some Danes flee in cowardice while others turn to devil worship to save themselves. Beowulf, prince of the Geats, hearing about Hrothgar's troubles, gathers 14 of his stoutest companions and they set sail for Hrothgar's lands. The Danes greet them, and Beowulf boasts to the king of his unparalleled awesomeness, particularly his success in fighting sea monsters. During the welcoming banquet, Unferth, presumably Hrothgar's champion, jealous of this attention, disparages Beowulf's resume, and Beowulf responds by accusing Unferth of drunkenness and of fratricide. That night, Grendel again attacks, but this time Beowulf fights the monster bare-knuckled, tearing off his arm. Grendel escapes, but dies soon afterwards at the bottom of the murky swamp that he and his mum call home. The timid Danish warriors, slinking back into the hall, no doubt with a bit of belt-adjusting swagger and throat-clearing, sing of Beowulf's triumph. But spare a thought for Grendel's bereaved mother. She avenges her son by attacking Heorot at night and carries off Ishur, Hrothgar's grand vizier. Beowulf volunteers to dive to the bottom of the swamp and destroy her. During the ensuing battle, Beowulf kills her with a magical sword that he finds on the wall of her home. How lucky is that? Like, the one weapon in the world that can kill her happens to be hanging above her mantle. Now, for good measure, he finds Grendel's corpse, cuts off the head, and swims home. How long can this guy hold his breath? Let's fast forward 50 years. Beowulf is now king of the Geats, because he's such a tremendous warrior. But a thief steals a jeweled cup from a sleeping dragon in his kingdom, which is never a wise move because dragons are notorious mercantilists. The dragon retaliates by burning down everyone's houses, including Beowulf's mead hall. Beowulf vows to destroy the dragon. He's now an old man, and his strength is not as it was in days gone by. So during the battle, Beowulf snaps his sword against the dragon's flank, and the enraged worm wounds Beowulf in the neck. Beowulf's followers abandon him, except for Wiglaf, who braves the flames to stab the dragon, allowing Beowulf summoning the last of his might to cut the dragon in two. But Beowulf knows that this is his last battle. Dying, he asks Wiglaf to take him to the dragon's treasure trove, and instructs him to build a tomb known as Beowulf's Barrow, or Beowulf's Tower, on the edge of the sea as a guide for sailors. Wiglaf oversees the funeral. The Geatish king is cremated, and his ashes, along with the dragon's treasure, are buried in the barrow. A Geatish woman wails as the smoke rises. She foresees a time of great tribulation. Kind of a gloomy ending for a heroic tale. The poem was composed somewhere between the 7th and 10th centuries. Various scholars lean one way or the other for a variety of reasons that don't really concern us here. My own thinking is that the poem circulated orally by shops, remember, quite early on, based perhaps on a variety of Scandinavian legends in history, and came to be written down somewhere near the end of the first millennium. We only have the one existing manuscript of Beowulf from the Noel Codex, one of 4 major collections of Anglo-Saxon poetry, like the Exeter Book, which we mentioned last time. This manuscript is written in a West Saxon dialect, which later on became the literary standard under King Alfred the Great in the 9th century, though there are some traces of other dialects, which I think seems to testify to a long oral transmission. We are quite lucky to have this manuscript, actually. And it's called the Cotton Vitellius, since it had been part of Sir Robert Cotton's collection of medieval manuscripts. Now, in the 18th century, this collection, to protect it from the fire threat that many felt was evident in the Essex House Library, so they moved it to the Ashburnham House, which burned in 1731. Oh, the irony. Seems like a name like Ashburnham might be a bad omen, but anyway, over 200 manuscripts were lost or damaged, and Beowulf does show some signs of a severe scorching. If you've seen the picture I posted on the social media pages, you can see some of the scorch marks in the upper corner. And yet we still have it, which is fortunate because had it been lost, we would have nothing to talk about today. And this episode of the podcast would be a festival of awkward silence and sniffling and foot shuffling. So, glad we avoided that. But this does lead me to my big question for this episode. Why does Beowulf even exist at all? Why did someone bother to write down an old Scandinavian pagan legend? And that someone was a Christian monk, which we know because in the early Middle Ages, only the clergy was literate. And not only that, but the process of bookmaking was incredibly labor-intensive and incredibly expensive. Everything had to be handwritten, obviously, since we're centuries before Gutenberg developed movable type, and it was written on vellum, which is the skin and membranes of calves. It could take nearly 200 calves to produce enough vellum for a Bible. So why would a Christian monk go through the time, the labor, and the expense to produce the manuscript of a pagan legend? Or, as the famous scholar Alcuin of York, the tutor of the great Charlemagne, would have put it, quid hieldis cum Christo? What has Ingeld to do with Christ? Here, Ingeld stands as a sort of metonym for Germanic heroic culture, which is in opposition to the compassionate passivity of Christian heroism. What does Germanic paganism have to do with Christianity? Why does Beowulf exist? Well, let's talk about that Germanic heroic culture. It was a military society, a warrior culture, so its chief virtues were courage, loyalty, and generosity, which all seem capital G good things. What may surprise us is that this society was not structured hierarchically. That is, it was not vertically oriented with a king on top and then some nobles and then some peasants at the bottom. That would come later in the Middle Ages after the Normans conquered England. The Germanic warrior cultures adopted a more horizontal orientation, a system of mutual obligation that we call comitatus. Now, in this system, a king wasn't a king because he had been divinely appointed. He was a king because he was the most successful warrior. He was the best at killing people and stealing their stuff. If he began to fail as a warrior, he could be replaced by someone more adept. So the king had obligations to his followers. He had to lead them in battle. He had to distribute any plunder among his warriors, which were called thanes. And he had to buy the drinks. It was always the king's shout in the mead hall. Now, on the other end, the warriors had to follow the king in battle. There was no days off. And should the king die, The warriors must exact vengeance. They must either kill the person who killed the king, or they must extract treasure from the person responsible for killing the king. Any soldier who failed to follow and avenge would be exiled for life from the nation. Let's look at this in action in an early passage from Beowulf. Then Hrothgar, taking the throne, led the Danes to such glory that comrades and kinsmen swore by his sword, and young men swelled his armies. And he thought of greatness, and resolved to build a hall that would hold his mighty band and reach higher toward heaven than anything that had ever been known to the sons of men. And in that hall he'd divide the spoils of their victories, to old and young what they'd earned in battle, but leaving the common pastures untouched, and taking no lives. The work was ordered, the timbers tied and shaped by the hosts that Hrothgar ruled. It was quickly ready, that most beautiful of dwellings, built as he'd wanted. And then he whose word was obeyed all over the earth named it Heorot. His boast come true, he commanded a banquet, opened out his treasureful hands. Hrothgar is glorious in battle, and so warriors flock to his banner. You stood a greater chance of becoming wealthy under a successful and generous king, one who shared, quote, the spoils of their victories. To that end, he builds a great mead hall, a physical manifestation, if you will, of that comitatus relationship. Here, the king gathers and celebrates with his warriors, shares out the treasure, and binds the society together. Now, certainly this description of Heorot and glory and massive drunken bashes appeals. But while we may feel initially sympathetic with a social order based on courage, proficiency, generosity, and solidarity, it's easy to forget that the ethic upon which this all is based is violence and vengeance. Now, no problem for a pagan Germanic spear-bearer, but it's something antithetical to the turn the other cheek ethos espoused by our transcribing monk, who goes out of his way to make pagan Germanic culture feel glorious, right? So again, wherefore Beowulf?
I'm Dan Heath. On the What It's Like to Be podcast, I ask folks about their jobs, like what keeps a TV meteorologist up at night.
When I'm at work and there's a tornado coming into town, my husband and my kids have to get into the tornado shelter without me.
What keeps a welder driven?
I never am satisfied. I always know I can do better.
And what keeps a hairstylist on her toes?
I know she likes that Holly Berry haircut, but she doesn't look like Holly Berry.
Find out on What It's Like to Be, wherever you get your podcasts.
I think if we read a bit more closely the description of Hrothgar's victories and architectural endeavors, we can see subtle hints of the monk's larger project. To wit, he describes Heorot as, quote, a hall that would hold his mighty band and reach higher toward heaven than anything that had ever been known to the sons of men. The greatest building ever. And you notice all the alliterative H's tie all this idea together. It really binds it tight. Those sounds bind this thing together. It's solid. The greatest building ever, a monument to Hrothgar's glory, his unrivaled power. But a clever listener, or reader, might sense the creeping presence of an illusion here. That's illusion with an A reference to an outside person, text, or event. The monk, I believe, in his description of Heorot's magnificence, massages his language to remind us of the biblical Tower of Babel from the book of Genesis in chapter 11. Remember that story from Sunday school, maybe, where all the peoples of the earth spoke one tongue? And so they gathered on the plain of Shinar, and they thought that their power was invincible. And so they said, according to verse 4, "Go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name. And of course, they're challenging God's greatness because they feel their own power. And God doesn't like it. And so God says no. And prang, he confounds their languages. And so they speak many tongues. And they can't understand each other. They can't work together. They can't collaborate. And so this project to reach heaven in their tower to challenge God disintegrates. Interestingly enough, once again, this idea of language as a creative force rears its head. This idea that because they can speak the same language, they have accrued greater power and they feel proud enough, hubristic enough to challenge God. So we get a gentle hint that Heorot, too, may be an example of human hubris, of the ultimate insufficiency of earthly endeavor. That while we may be made in the image of God, we are not gods, but mortals, subject to time and mutability. This sense is continued in the monk's allusion to the monster Grendel's ancestry. Quote, "He was spawned in that slime, conceived by a pair of those monsters born of Cain, murderous creatures banished by God, punished forever for the crime of Abel's death. The Almighty drove those demons out, and their exile was bitter, shut away from men. They split into 1,000 forms of evil, spirits and fiends, goblins, monsters, giants, a brood forever opposing the Lord's will, and again defeated." Now, the reference here is to the story of Cain and Abel, the sons of Adam and Eve, from Genesis chapter 4. You may remember that story. Cain and Abel make offerings to God. God, for unknown reasons, favors Abel's offering, which causes Cain great jealousy. So Cain says to his brother, "Hey, Abel, come here." And he whacks him. The first murder from the first act of religion. Isn't that interesting? So by making Grendel a descendant of Cain, the first murderer, the monk amplifies Grendel's threat. No longer is Grendel simply the monster in the wood that the hero will have to slay. Now he's an embodiment of cosmic evil, of genetic or essential evil. The avatar of a transcendent evil that can't be overcome finally by human means alone, but only by God. Now, while we know, because we know how monster stories go, that Beowulf will defeat Grendel, we also come to understand that the cosmic evil that Grendel bodies forth persists beyond the warrior's transient victory. In this passage from Beowulf, there also seems to be an implied connection between the offspring of Cain and the Nephilim, the race of giant monsters, perhaps fallen angels, referenced in the biblical books of Genesis, Numbers, and Ezekiel. So Cain is also the father of abominations as well as the father of civilization. Such an interesting story. Really, go back to Genesis if you haven't and look at it again, because mind-blowingly cool. Anyway, at the very incipience of the first conflict of the Beowulf epic, the monk simultaneously celebrates the honor and glory of the warrior code while gesturing, through biblical allusions, to its deficiency. If we look at the result of Beowulf's victory, we can see more ambivalence. Clearly, Grendel represents the inverse of the Germanic hero code. He's cowardly. He attacks his victims while they sleep in the dark. He's treacherous. He's gluttonous. He's the funhouse mirror version, when you think of it, of Hrothgar and his warriors. That Hrothgar is unable to maintain the comitatus bond marks not just defeat, but a kind of apocalypse, actually. The fundamental mechanism of social cohesion and cultural identity has failed and has been defeated by a distorted image of its own values. Quote, "Then each warrior tried to escape him, searched for rest in different beds, as far from Heorot as they could find, seeing how Grendel hunted when they slept. Distance was safety. The only survivors were those who fled him. Hate had triumphed. So Grendel ruled, fought with the righteous, won against many, and won. So Heorot stood empty, and stayed deserted for years, 12 winters of grief for Hrothgar, king of the Danes, sorrow heaped at his door by hell-forged hands. His misery leaped the seas, was told and sung in all men's ears, how Grendel's hatred began, how the monster relished his savage war on the Danes, keeping the bloody feud alive, seeking no peace, offering no truce, accepting no settlement, no price in gold or land, and paying the living for one crime only with another. No one waited for reparation from his plundering claws. That shadow of death haunted in the darkness, stalked Hrothgar's warriors. The warriors flee in fear, abdicating their duty to fight for Hrothgar, because he has failed in his duty to protect them. Grendel refuses the traditional appeasements of war. There's no truce, no bribe. Hrothgar's shame travels far and wide. The shops are at work, and for a culture in which reputation is legacy, Hrothgar endures the ultimate shame. But in a weird way, the honor code still obtains after Beowulf defeats Grendel. Grendel's mother attacks Heorot to avenge the death of her son. Quote, Grendel's mother, monster of women, mourned her woe, and his mother now, gloomy and grim, would go on that last quest of sorrow, the death of her son, to avenge. Again, the funhouse mirror effect. While we are to understand Grendel's mother as another and explicitly gendered villain, such a conclusion seems kind of absurd. She's behaving exactly as she should, right? The code demands that honor be satisfied, and so her attack on Heorot should be entirely justified. It's vengeance according to the demands of the pagan warrior ethic. So it seems that these demands imply and hasten their own defeat. Let's pop down to the end of the epic. Beowulf has had a glorious and prosperous reign when the original of Tolkien's Smaug wreaks his own vengeance for the theft of his treasure. A treasure he hoards, by the way, right, in direct violation of the heroic generosity that organized the warrior economy. Beowulf dies nobly, ensuring that his story will live on. These are Beowulf's last wishes. Quote, My time is gone. Have the brave Geats build me a tomb when the funeral flames have burned me, and build it here at the water's edge, high on this spit of land, so sailors can see this tower and remember my name and call it Beowulf's Tower, and boats in the darkness and mist crossing the sea will know it. He's asking for, essentially, a lighthouse as a monument. Now think about it. What does a lighthouse do? Well, it serves as a warning of danger, a guide to safety. It doesn't seem a huge leap to me that the monk is envisioning Beowulf's story as a kind of warning guide. Here's what I mean. Let's see what Beowulf's people think during his funeral. Quote, The bearers brought their beloved lord, their glorious king, and weeping laid him high on the wood. Then the warriors began to kindle that greatest of funeral fires. Smoke rose above the flames, black and thick, and while the wind blew and the fire roared, they wept, and Beowulf's body crumbled and was gone. The Geats stayed, moaning their sorrow, lamenting their lord. A gnarled old woman, hair wound tight and gray on her head, groaned a song of misery. of infinite sadness and days of mourning, of fear and sorrow to come, slaughter and terror and captivity, and heaven swallowed the billowing smoke. Jeez. That really is one of the most harrowing descriptions of a funeral I've ever read. Look at the verbs here. Weeping, roared, wept, crumbled, moaning, lamenting, groaned. The bleakness engulfs all action. Beowulf was the greatest of lords, beloved and glorious, the best there ever was, the very pith and marrow of the pagan Germanic warrior. But he's gone. Gone. What will follow? Infinite sadness, days of mourning, fear, sorrow, slaughter, terror, and captivity. Ultimately, Beowulf fails. His long history of glorious victories is only a temporary stay against the forces of enduring evil. But never is the monk dismissive of Beowulf or his values or his culture. Heck, the monk is an Anglo-Saxon himself, perhaps even a retired warrior, so he treats that culture with great respect. But he also can't escape the notion that the most heroic and heroically virtuous of men was just a mortal man. In the end, the pagan warrior culture, in all its glory, is ill-equipped to provide lasting salvation. That's the danger I believe the monk warns against. That's why he takes the effort to record and edit the pagan legend. As recounted by this monk, Beowulf's story, like a lighthouse, guides us away from the rocks. But to where? Well, friend listener, next time we'll try answering that question. Here's a hint, if you haven't twigged it yet. The monk may be advocating for a hero who has overcome death. If you think you know who, write your answer on the back of a $20 bill and send it to me here in the clubhouse. In our next episode, we will look at Anglo-Saxon elegies, their other major poetic mode, to see what those poets suggest as an alternative to the comitatus model. I will pop some links to the poems up on the Insta-Twitbook pages. Please like and subscribe to the Classic English Literature Podcast and encourage family, friends, colleagues, and strangers to do the same. I'd be ever so humbled by your posting positive reviews of the show. Thank you very much for stopping by. I look forward to your visiting again. Till next time, all best.